The laughter spread across the ballroom like spilled champagne. Not loud, not vulgar, just soft enough to humiliate. Lady Margaret Prescott stood alone beneath the blazing chandeliers of Prescott House, her gloved fingers resting on the marble balustrade while the most fashionable people in London whispered behind silk fans. "Too clever for her own good," one lady murmured. "Poor creature," another replied. "A woman who thinks like a man never marries well." Margaret did not turn. She had learned long ago that turning only rewarded cruelty. Across the room, violin strings soared through a bright waltz while couples glided across polished floors. Diamonds flashed, laughter rose, titles and fortunes mingled as effortlessly as the music. And yet she stood outside it all, because tonight the Ton had decided something. Miss Margaret Prescott was brilliant. Brilliant, and therefore unacceptable. Her father's railway empire stretched from Manchester to the Scottish border. Her fortune dwarfed many noble estates. Her calculations for expanding industrial routes had already rescued 3 failing companies. But intelligence in a woman, London insisted, was a flaw, especially when it surpassed the men around her. "She frightens them," her aunt had once whispered with pity. Margaret had simply replied, "Then they should not approach." Tonight had been the final test. 5 proposals in 2 years. 5 men who admired her fortune but winced when she spoke about steel, engines, or trade routes. 5 men who eventually said the same thing in different voices. "You are remarkable, Miss Prescott, but perhaps you might leave the thinking to your husband." She had refused each one calmly, and the ballroom had decided that refusal meant arrogance. A ripple of laughter swept the room again. Margaret lifted her chin slightly. Let them laugh. They would not see the small tightening in her chest, nor the quiet sting of humiliation burning behind her steady expression. Because humiliation, she had learned, must be carried with dignity. A servant approached with a silver tray. "A message has arrived for you, Miss Prescott." She frowned slightly. "At this hour?" "Yes, miss. The messenger insisted it was urgent." The envelope was thick, sealed in dark wax. A crest she did not recognize pressed sharply into the seal. Margaret broke it open. The letter inside contained only a few lines. But those lines made her breath stop. "Lady Margaret Prescott, I have been informed you are a woman who values honesty over courtesy. Therefore, I will offer you the same. My name is William Hawthorne, Duke of Silvermont. My estates are ruined, my title is nearly worthless, my reputation is worse. I require a wife. You require a husband who will not fear your mind. If you are willing to consider a practical union, I will arrive in London within the fortnight. E. Silvermont." Margaret read the words twice, then a third time. A ruined duke, not begging, not flattering, simply stating facts like terms in a contract. Something unexpected stirred inside her, not romance. Recognition. Across the ballroom, a group of gentlemen laughed again, louder this time. One of them said, just loud enough to carry across the marble floor, "Miss Prescott will likely marry her railway maps before she marries a man." More laughter followed. Margaret folded the letter slowly, very carefully. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Never trust a man who hides behind pretty words, Maggie. Truth usually sounds blunt." She slipped the letter into her reticule and turned back toward the ballroom. The orchestra swelled. Candles flickered. And for the first time that evening, Margaret allowed herself a faint, dangerous thought. Perhaps a ruined duke had less reason to pretend than the men still pretending to be powerful. But she did not yet know something else. Far across the English countryside at that very moment, the Duke of Silvermont was standing alone inside the cold halls of a half-abandoned estate, and he had just made the most desperate decision of his life. Because Margaret Prescott was not the only one being mocked by society. William Hawthorne had already been destroyed by it. And this marriage proposal was not his first attempt at survival. It was his last. The Duke of Silvermont arrived in London on a grey afternoon that smelled faintly of rain and horse leather. Margaret was informed of his arrival while reviewing freight ledgers in her father's study, a room that had gradually become her own command center. The large oak desk was buried beneath railway charts, investment reports, and engineering sketches. No embroidery frames, no piano music, nothing that resembled the gentle life expected of a lady. Her butler cleared his throat quietly. "Your Grace has arrived, Miss Prescott." Margaret did not look up immediately. "Already?" "Yes, miss." He requested no formal announcement. That alone was unusual. Dukes preferred spectacle. Titles liked to enter rooms the way thunder entered storms. Margaret set down her pen and finally rose. "Very well," she said calmly. "Send him in." A moment later the study door opened, and William Hawthorne stepped inside. Margaret had expected many things. Arrogance, elegance, perhaps a certain weary charm. But not this. The man standing before her looked exhausted, Not weak, but worn. His coat was impeccably tailored, though clearly older than current fashion. His posture carried the quiet authority of someone raised to command rooms like this one, yet there was something else beneath that composure. A shadow. His dark hair was slightly disordered from travel. His jaw bore the faint roughness of someone who had not cared to shave that morning. And his eyes, they were not the bright, confident eyes of London society. They were the eyes of a man who had seen something collapse. Margaret studied him with open curiosity. "You came quickly, Your Grace." His voice, when he spoke, carried a deep, restrained calm. "I have learned that delay rarely improves unpleasant circumstances." Not defensive, simply honest. Margaret gestured toward the chair opposite her desk. "Please sit." He did, but not comfortably. Men accustomed to wealth usually relaxed into expensive chairs as if they owned them. William Hawthorne sat as if he expected to leave again at any moment. Margaret remained standing. "I assume you understand," she began, folding her arms lightly, "that your letter was unconventional." The corner of his mouth moved faintly. I was attempting to avoid deception. A pause. Then she asked directly, "Why me?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, his gaze traveled slowly across the room. The maps, the ledgers, the mechanical sketches pinned beside the window. Recognition flickered across his face. "You built this," he said quietly. "My father began it," Margaret replied. "I expanded it. And London finds that unsettling." She raised an eyebrow. "You appear well informed." "I made inquiries," he admitted. She walked toward the desk. "I'm sure you discovered the same things everyone does." "A fortune," William said. "A reputation. And several gentlemen who have recently withdrawn their interest in marriage." Margaret's lips pressed together. "Withdrawn is a generous interpretation. They were intimidated," he said simply. Silence stretched between them. Then Margaret spoke again. "And you are not?" He met her gaze. "No, not arrogance, just fact." That unsettled her more than arrogance would have. She moved behind the desk and leaned lightly against it. "You said in your letter that your title is nearly worthless." "It is. And that your reputation is worse." A brief shadow passed over his face. "Considerably worse." "What happened?" William leaned back slightly in his chair. For a moment he looked older than 30. 3 years ago, he said quietly. "My family estates collapsed under accumulated debts." "That alone would not ruin a duke." "No," he agreed. "The scandal came afterward." He paused, as though weighing whether truth was still worth the cost. "I fought a duel." Margaret blinked. "In Hyde Park." "At dawn? Over a woman?" "No," he said. "Over an accusation." The faintest tension moved through his jaw. "The other man survived," he continued. "But London decided the story was too entertaining to abandon." Margaret studied him carefully. "Are the rumors true?" He did not hesitate. "Most of them." That honesty again. Blunt, unpolished, almost uncomfortable. Margaret rested one hand on the desk. "And now you want to marry a woman society already finds inconvenient?" "Yes." "And you believe that arrangement would benefit me?" William leaned forward slightly. "I believe," he said quietly, "that you require a husband who will not attempt to silence you. And I require a wife who does not expect a perfect duke." Their eyes held. Something unfamiliar passed between them. Not attraction, recognition. Two reputations already damaged. Two people society had quietly decided were mistakes. Margaret exhaled slowly. "I have conditions." He nodded once. "I assumed you would." "For 3 months," she said, "you will work with my railway company." "Not as a duke. As an employee." His brow lifted slightly. "Unpaid." Silence filled the room. William Hawthorne studied her as though recalculating something. "And if I refuse?" "Then you leave London tomorrow," Margaret said calmly. "And we both save ourselves unnecessary disappointment." For several seconds he said nothing. Outside, carriage wheels rolled across wet pavement. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows. Finally, William rose. Tall enough that Margaret had to lift her chin slightly to meet his eyes. "Very well," he said. "I accept your terms." A flicker of surprise crossed her expression. But then he added something unexpected. "However," William continued calmly, "I will require one condition as well." Margaret narrowed her eyes slightly. "What condition?" His answer was quiet. "While you evaluate my competence, I will evaluate your heart." The words landed between them like a challenge neither had anticipated. Margaret's pulse shifted, sharp, unexpected, because no man had ever asked to see beyond the empire she had built. And something about the way William Hawthorne said it suggested he meant exactly that. 3 weeks after the Duke of Silvermont began working for Prescott Railways, the gentlemen of London had discovered a new form of amusement. They watched him, a duke, An actual Duke, standing in the muddy yards of Margaret Prescott's railway depot. Extraordinary, one gentleman murmured from the safety of his carriage. Utterly humiliating, another agreed. Margaret heard every whisper, but she ignored them. The rail yard that morning was alive with movement, iron wheels screeching, steam hissing, workers shouting orders through the cold gray air. And in the center of it stood William Hawthorne. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. His coat hung over a railing nearby, and grease marked one of his cuffs. Margaret paused at the edge of the platform, watching him without announcing her presence. He was speaking with Sullivan, the chief engineer, who was pointing toward a locomotive wheel assembly. William listened carefully, not pretending, not nodding politely, actually listening. Then he crouched beside the machinery, studying the metal joints with a thoughtful frown. "Because the stress builds here," William said slowly, tapping the iron plate. "If the pressure isn't distributed, the axle weakens first." Sullivan looked impressed. "That's exactly what we've been seeing." Margaret felt a strange tightening in her chest. Most men of his rank would have recoiled from soot and steel, yet here he was, thinking, learning, working. Sullivan spotted her first. "Miss Prescott!" William turned. Their eyes met across the drifting steam. For a moment neither spoke. Something unspoken passed between them. Margaret stepped forward. "Your Grace," she said evenly, "I see you have discovered machinery." A faint smile appeared on his lips. "I find it refreshingly honest." "How so?" "Engines break for real reasons," he replied. "They do not pretend otherwise." Sullivan chuckled and wandered off, leaving them alone beside the locomotive. Margaret folded her arms. "And what conclusions have you reached during your apprenticeship?" William wiped his hands with a cloth. "That your company is losing money on maintenance." "I know that." "Yes," he said. "But not for the reason your board believes." Her eyebrow lifted slightly. "Go on." He gestured toward the engine. "You treat every locomotive identically. That is standard procedure. It is also inefficient." Margaret frowned. "Explain." "Each engine has its own weaknesses," William said. "If mechanics recorded those differences, repairs could be predicted instead of discovered after failure." Margaret stared at him. That was exactly the argument she had presented to the board 2 months earlier, an argument they had dismissed, because it came from her. "You arrived at that conclusion quickly," she said carefully. William shrugged lightly. "When a system begins failing," he said quietly, "it is usually because the people in charge are afraid to adjust it." She studied him more closely. "You speak as though from experience." A shadow flickered across his face. "I am." Margaret hesitated, then asked the question she had avoided since their first meeting. "What truly happened to your estates?" For a moment the rail yard noise seemed to fade. William leaned against the iron railing beside the engine. "My father built everything around pride," he said slowly. "Old traditions, old debts, old expectations." "And you?" "I tried to preserve it." His gaze drifted across the yard. "I delayed decisions, avoided risks, listened to men who feared change." His voice softened, and by the time I realized they were wrong, it was too late. Margaret felt a sudden, unexpected sympathy, because she recognized the weight in his voice. "Loss," she said quietly. William looked at her. "You understand that word?" She held his gaze. "My brother died 3 years ago," she said. The admission surprised even her. William did not interrupt. "He was supposed to inherit the company," Margaret continued. "He was brilliant." Her hands tightened slightly in her gloves. "After his death, everything became my responsibility." William's voice was gentle. "That must have been lonely." Margaret almost laughed. "Lonely?" She turned toward the roaring yard. "Every man in London believes I am either a curiosity or a threat." And then she looked back at him. "Which one are you?" William met her eyes steadily. "Neither." Silence stretched between them. The steam from the engine drifted around them like fog. Finally he spoke again. "I think you are tired," he said quietly. The words struck deeper than she expected. Margaret straightened immediately. "I am not tired." "No," he agreed. "You are determined." A pause. "But determination is often the armor people wear when they are exhausted." Her heart jolted unexpectedly. She turned away. "I have work to review," she said sharply. William did not follow, but his voice stopped her just before she reached the stairs. "Margaret." It was the first time he had used her name. She paused. "Yes?" "Thank you," he said simply. "For letting me try." She did not answer, but as she climbed the iron staircase toward her office, her pulse refused to return to its usual calm rhythm. Because something unsettling had begun to change. For the first time in years, someone was not afraid of her mind, and far more dangerously, he seemed to understand her heart. Margaret had spent years ensuring that no one ever saw her break, not in boardrooms, Not in ballrooms, not even alone in the quiet halls of Prescott House. But on a rain-soaked afternoon in late November, William Hawthorne saw something he was never meant to witness. He had entered her office without knocking, a rare mistake. There had been an urgent telegram regarding a damaged bridge near Leeds, and he had come to place the report directly on her desk. The door creaked softly as it opened. Margaret stood near the tall window, her back turned to him. At first he thought she had not heard him. Then he noticed what she was holding, a photograph. The glass frame trembled slightly in her hands. Her shoulders, usually straight as steel, were bowed in a way he had never seen before. William stepped back instinctively, but the door shifted against the frame with a quiet sound. Margaret turned sharply. For one brief, fragile second, her expression was unguarded. Shock, pain, something dangerously close to grief. Then the walls returned. Cold, impenetrable. "You should knock," she said, her voice composed again. "My apologies," William replied calmly. He placed the telegram on the desk. "There is damage on the Leeds Bridge. The engineers request immediate authorization to suspend rail traffic for several hours." Margaret moved past him without another word. She set the photograph face down on the shelf beside her desk. "Approved," she said briskly. "Divert the cargo train south until the inspection is finished." Of course. William should have left. The moment clearly did not belong to him, but something about the way she avoided looking at the photograph kept him where he stood. "Was that your brother?" he asked quietly. Her spine stiffened. "That is none of your concern." "No," he said calmly, "but it may become so." Margaret turned toward him sharply. "We are discussing railways, Lord Hawthorne, not my family." "We are discussing marriage," he corrected gently. The words hung in the air. Margaret's jaw tightened. "You are testing my patience, and you are testing my honesty." For a long moment neither moved. Then Margaret exhaled slowly, not surrendering, but allowing something to slip past her defenses. "His name was George," she said quietly. William did not interrupt. "He was younger than me," she continued. "Brilliant with machinery, far better suited to the company than I ever was." Her gaze drifted briefly toward the photograph. "He was designing a signaling system that would have prevented half the railway accidents in England." William frowned slightly. "Was?" Margaret's fingers pressed against the edge of the desk. "He died during a night inspection 3 years ago." The words were delivered calmly, too calmly, crushed between two rail cars. William's chest tightened. "I'm sorry." She shook her head sharply. "Do not say that." Her voice dropped lower. "Because I don't believe it was an accident." Silence settled heavily between them. William studied her carefully. "You believe someone caused it?" She nodded faintly. George's invention would have forced several powerful companies to rebuild their signaling systems. And that would have cost them a fortune. "Yes." Margaret's voice grew colder. "I hired an investigator. He discovered inconsistencies in the accident reports. And he received threats." The word sounded almost bitter. "He abandoned the investigation within a week." Margaret turned back toward the window. "My father was already ill. The company needed stability." Her hand rested against the glass. "So I buried the truth." William stepped closer, though still careful not to invade her space. "You didn't bury it," he said quietly. "You carried it." She closed her eyes for a brief moment. "That is not a difference." "It is." Margaret opened her eyes again. "And what would you know about carrying ghosts, Your Grace?" The question was sharper than intended. William did not flinch. "I spent 3 years trying to save an estate that was already dead." His voice remained steady. "I listened to advisors who feared change. I delayed decisions that should have been made quickly." He looked down briefly, and when everything collapsed, I realized the truth. Margaret studied him. "What truth?" "That pride can destroy a legacy faster than failure." Their eyes met again, two people standing inside very different ruins. "You think we are similar," Margaret said. "I know we are." That unsettled her more than sympathy would have. Margaret turned away again. "I have work to finish." William nodded. "Of course." He moved toward the door. But before he reached it, Margaret spoke again. "William." He stopped. "My brother believed railways could change the world," she said quietly. "Safer travel, faster connections, opportunity for people who had none." Her voice softened slightly. "I refuse to let his work disappear." William turned back toward her. "And it won't." Margaret looked skeptical. "You sound very certain." "I am." A pause. "Because you are not the kind of woman who allows unfinished things to remain unfinished." The faintest crack appeared in her composure, something like relief or recognition. William inclined his head respectfully and left the office. But as Margaret stood alone again beside the window, her fingers drifted slowly toward the photograph on the shelf. and for the first time in years, the secret she had buried did not feel quite so heavy, because someone else now knew it existed, and William Hawthorne had just realized something equally dangerous. The brilliant woman London mocked was not driven by ambition. She was driven by justice. The boardroom of Prescott Railways had always been designed to intimidate. Dark walnut walls, heavy velvet curtains, a long polished table where 10 men sat like judges behind their ledgers. Margaret Prescott stood at the head of that table, presenting expansion plans for the northern rail lines. She had done this dozens of times. She knew every number, every projected cost, every mile of track, and yet the room already carried the familiar scent of resistance. Jonathan Pierce leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Pierce was Margaret's largest shareholder after her own family. He was also the man who had opposed nearly every proposal she made. "Miss Prescott," he said slowly, "your northern expansion proposal is ambitious." Margaret kept her voice even. The northern route would secure freight transport before our competitors reached those ports. Pierce smiled thinly. "Or it would bury us under construction costs." Murmurs of agreement moved along the table. Margaret did not look at them. She had learned long ago that men preferred to question her confidence rather than her calculations. "These numbers are accurate," she said calmly. Pierce tapped the paper with one finger. "They are your numbers. And your point?" "My point," Pierce replied smoothly, "is that perhaps the board would feel more comfortable if an independent voice confirmed them." The word independent lingered in the room like poison. Margaret knew exactly what he meant. A woman's conclusions required male approval. Before she could respond, another director spoke. "Perhaps Lord Hawthorne might review the projections." Margaret's spine stiffened slightly. Across the room, William Hawthorne sat quietly near the far wall. He had attended the meeting only as an observer. She had insisted upon that. Pierce's eyes glittered. "Yes," he said. "After all, our foreign consultant has become very influential lately." The insult was subtle, but unmistakable. Margaret's cheeks warmed. "Lord Hawthorne has no authority to—" "Actually," William said calmly, rising from his chair. The entire room shifted. There was something about a duke standing to speak that silenced even stubborn businessmen. "I do have an opinion," he continued quietly. Margaret shot him a warning glance. He ignored it. William walked toward the table, placing Margaret's reports in front of Pierce. "I have reviewed these calculations carefully," he said. "They are sound." Pierce scoffed. "And what experience do you have with English railways, Your Grace?" William's voice remained calm. "Very little." A few directors smirked. But then he continued. "I do, however, have extensive experience with financial collapse." The room quieted. William leaned forward slightly. "And I can assure you of something." He tapped the papers. "These projections are not reckless. They are necessary." Pierce's smile faded. "And how exactly have you reached that conclusion?" William's gaze swept across the table. "Because hesitation destroys opportunity faster than risk ever does." He straightened again. "I spent years listening to cautious men who believed waiting was wisdom." His voice lowered slightly. "It cost my family everything." The room had gone completely still now. "And Miss Prescott," he continued, glancing toward Margaret briefly, "is doing precisely what I should have done." Margaret felt a strange warmth tighten in her throat. No one had ever defended her calculations in that room. Not once. Pierce tried to recover his composure. "Even if your enthusiasm is admirable, Lord Hawthorne, the board cannot ignore the possibility that Miss Prescott's judgment may be—" He paused deliberately, influenced. The implication landed like a slap. Margaret's hands clenched slightly at her sides. Before she could respond, William spoke again. His voice had changed, colder now. "Influenced by what precisely?" Pierce shrugged. A charming foreign title can be persuasive. William's eyes hardened. "You believe she lacks the intelligence to think independently?" "No," Pierce said smoothly. "I believe she may trust the wrong advisors." William held his gaze steadily. "Then allow me to correct your misunderstanding." The room felt suddenly smaller. "Miss Prescott does not follow my advice," he said quietly. "I follow hers." A stunned silence filled the boardroom. William placed Margaret's report back on the table. "These numbers," he continued, "are precise, strategic, and if they had been written by a man in this room—" He paused. "None of you would be questioning them." No one spoke, not even Pierce. Finally, the chairman cleared his throat. "All those in favor of approving the northern expansion." Hands lifted slowly, one by one. The motion passed. When the meeting ended, the directors left quickly, murmuring among themselves. Soon only Margaret and William remained in the vast room. She stood near the window, staring out at the gray London sky. "You should not have done that," she said quietly. William placed his notebook on the table. "I know. You made things worse." Possibly. Margaret turned toward him. Then why? William studied her for a moment. Because you were right. The simplicity of the answer unsettled her more than any argument. They will say I rely on you now, she said softly. They already say worse things. She hesitated. You embarrassed Pierce. William's expression remained calm. That was merely a pleasant side effect. Margaret almost smiled. Almost. But then the weight of the moment settled again. You defended me, she said quietly. William stepped a little closer. I defended the truth. Their eyes met, and something shifted between them again. Something warmer. Something far more dangerous, because for the first time in years, Margaret Prescott did not feel entirely alone inside that room. Margaret arrived at William's lodging long after midnight. The streets of London were nearly silent, the lamps along the narrow lane flickering against damp cobblestones. Her carriage had stopped a full block away. She had walked the rest of the distance alone, her cloak pulled tightly against the cold wind. She knocked 3 times, firm, decisive. Inside, William was seated at a small desk reviewing freight ledgers by lamplight. The knock startled him. Few people knew where he stayed, and fewer still would come at such an hour. When he opened the door, he froze. Margaret stood there, breath uneven, dark hair loosened slightly by the wind. For the first time since he had known her, she looked uncertain. May I come in? She asked quietly. William stepped aside at once. Of course. The room was modest, far removed from the grandeur expected of a duke. A narrow bed stood against one wall, papers covered the desk, and a small iron stove glowed faintly in the corner. Margaret noticed all of it, but she said nothing. Instead, she removed her gloves slowly and walked toward the small window. Outside, snow had begun to fall. Pierce visited me tonight, she said at last. William's shoulders stiffened. I suspected he might. He offered to buy my shares in the company. William frowned. That is ambitious. He said it kindly, she continued, as though he were rescuing me from a burden. Her voice sharpened slightly. Then he explained the real reason. William already knew. Me. Margaret turned toward him. Yes. Silence filled the room. He believes you are my weakness, she said quietly. William studied her carefully. And do you? The question hung between them like a blade. Margaret inhaled slowly. No. Then her voice softened. But I am afraid others might. William stepped closer. Fear has never guided your decisions before. That was before you. The confession surprised them both. Margaret looked away quickly. When you defended me at the board meeting, she said, something changed. Her hands clasped together tightly. I felt protected. William did not move. And that frightened you, he said gently. Yes. She met his eyes again. Because protection always has a price. William's voice softened. Not always. It has in my experience. The words carried the quiet weight of years. William drew a slow breath. Then allow me to be honest with you. She waited. I came to London intending to arrange a practical marriage. His gaze dropped briefly. I expected convenience. Not admiration. Certainly not attachment. Margaret's pulse quickened slightly. But then I met you, he continued, and discovered something deeply inconvenient. Her voice was barely above a whisper. What? You changed my expectations. Silence fell again. The small stove crackled softly. Margaret stepped closer. Pierce has begun investigating you, she said. Your past. The duel. The debts. William nodded. I assumed he would. He says you are using me. The word sounded bitter. That you will leave the moment your fortunes improve. William's expression tightened. And what do you believe? Margaret hesitated. Then she said the one truth she could not hide. I am afraid of losing you. The admission landed between them like a fragile thing. William closed the distance between them slowly. Margaret. She looked up at him. You are not something I intend to lose. How can you know that? She whispered. How can I trust it? William raised his hand carefully, slow enough that she could step away if she wished. She did not. His fingers brushed her cheek gently. You cannot know, he said softly. Trust is always a risk. Margaret's breath trembled. And you are willing to take it? Yes. Why? William smiled faintly. Because you are worth the danger. A single tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. William wiped it away with his thumb. You are not my weakness, he murmured. You are the strongest choice I have ever made. Margaret's hand rested against his chest without thinking. His heart was beating fast. So is this, she whispered. A mistake? William covered her hand with his own. Perhaps. His voice lowered. But if it is, I would rather make that mistake with you. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, then slowly rested her forehead against his chest. William wrapped his arms around her carefully, holding her as though she might break if he moved too quickly. For several quiet seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Margaret lifted her head. "I do not want to wait for our agreement to end," she said softly. William's breath caught. "What do you want instead?" She met his eyes with a courage that surprised even herself. "You." The word hung between them. William leaned down slowly. Their first kiss was not hurried, not desperate, it was careful. A promise forming between two people who had both spent years guarding their hearts. When they finally parted, Margaret exhaled softly. "There are 2 weeks left," she whispered. William smiled gently. "I am aware. And if London sees us?" He brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "Then London will simply have to become accustomed to the truth." Margaret allowed herself a small smile, but neither of them yet knew how quickly that truth would be tested, because by morning, London would discover a secret about William Hawthorne that threatened to destroy everything they had just begun. The scandal reached London before sunrise. By the time Margaret arrived at Prescott Railways the next morning, a copy of Nombre, the London Chronicle, already lay waiting on her desk. The headline was short: "Cruel. Ruined Duke seeks fortune through industrial heiress." Margaret read the article once, then again. Each line dripped with insinuation. William Hawthorne, disgraced aristocrat, debts exceeding £300,000, a desperate attempt to secure financial rescue through marriage. Her fingers tightened around the paper, not because she believed it, but because she understood exactly what Pierce intended. A knock sounded at the door. William entered before she could answer. He had clearly seen the article already. His expression was calm, but there was something tense beneath it. "Pierce has moved quickly," he said quietly. Margaret placed the paper down. "Yes." Silence stretched between them. "I should leave London," William said after a moment. The words struck her like cold water. "What?" "If I remain," he continued steadily, "he will continue using me to undermine you." Margaret rose from her chair. "You believe abandoning me will solve that. I believe protecting you matters more than my pride." Margaret stared at him. "That is not protection. It is reality." William's voice remained calm. "You built this company with your own hands. I will not allow my reputation to destroy it." For a moment, neither moved. Then Margaret spoke quietly. "You promised you would stay." "I promised I would not harm you." "You are not harming me." The intensity in her voice made him pause. "You are the one man who has ever treated my mind as something worthy of respect." She continued. "And you think I will allow a newspaper to decide whether you remain in my life?" William stepped closer. "You deserve a future without scandal." Margaret met his gaze without hesitation. "My future is not decided by gossip." Her voice softened slightly. "It is decided by me." William looked at her carefully, as is mine. Silence returned, heavy, uncertain. Then the boardroom door opened. Pierce entered with several directors behind him. His smile was slow and triumphant. "Miss Prescott," he said smoothly. "We felt it best to discuss the situation immediately." Margaret did not sit. "Then discuss it." Pierce held up the newspaper. "It appears your consultant has neglected to disclose certain financial complications." William stepped forward. "I have concealed nothing." Pierce raised an eyebrow. £300,000 in debt is not a minor complication. "The debts belong to my estates," William replied calmly. "And they will be resolved." Pierce smiled wider. "Of course." He turned toward the other directors. "But perhaps we must consider whether Miss Prescott's judgment has been compromised." The accusation hung in the room. Margaret felt every eye watching her, waiting, judging. William inhaled slowly. Then he did something neither Margaret nor Pierce expected. He stepped forward, directly into the center of the room. "Allow me to clarify something," he said quietly. The calm authority in his voice silenced everyone. "My debts are real. My estates are damaged. My reputation is questionable." Pierce looked pleased, but William continued. "What is not questionable is my intention." He turned toward Margaret. The room seemed to shrink around them. "Miss Prescott," he said, "you once asked whether I feared your mind." Her heart began to race. "I do not." He reached into his coat pocket and removed a small velvet box. Gasps spread across the boardroom. Pierce's smile vanished. William opened the box slowly. A simple gold ring rested inside. "Margaret Prescott," he said steadily. "I came to London searching for survival, but I found something far more valuable." His voice softened. "I found you." The directors watched in stunned silence. "You are the most brilliant woman I have ever known. The strongest. The most courageous." He took one step closer, and I refuse to allow fear or gossip to separate us. Margaret's breath trembled. "Therefore I will ask you plainly. He lowered himself slightly, not theatrically, but sincerely. Will you marry me? The room held its breath. Margaret looked at the ring, then at William, at the man who had defended her when no one else had, the man who had chosen truth over pride. Slowly she stepped forward. Yes, she said softly. Then louder. Yes, William. Pierce's face drained of color. The directors erupted into murmurs. But Margaret heard none of it. William slid the ring onto her finger. His hands trembled slightly. Are you certain? He whispered. Margaret smiled through tears she no longer tried to hide. For the first time in years, she said, I am completely certain. Outside the boardroom windows, locomotives thundered along the tracks. The world continued moving forward, and inside that room, two people who had once been mocked by society had chosen something far stronger than reputation. They had chosen each other.